thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to Bell House for inviting me along this evening. So my name is Gabriella Kountourides, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Oxford, and I study premenstrual syndrome. And we're trying to understand why people experience such different symptoms and severity of symptoms. So in this talk, I am going to be talking about a brief overview of what the menstrual cycle is, and then I'm going to give an explanation of the different views throughout history that we've had on menstruation, and then finally I'll be moving on to the current research. So before we get started, I just thought I'd ease us into it because, you know, Zoom meetings are very strange. So we've got a little light-hearted quiz. I know you can't interact with me on the screen because we're not in person, so just shout at your computer or have a think. So what animals get periods aside from humans? If you've said primates, you'd be quite right. Some primates get periods. Perhaps nobody thought bats, so we definitely get some bats getting periods, but not all. And then lastly, we have the spiny mouse right here and the elephant shrew, which is not a mouse nor an elephant, but they're very sweet. So these weird collection of animals get periods. So what could be going on? Before I get to the actual talk, I'd just like to say a small word about the language that I'm going to be using in this presentation. So when I use the word woman, I'm going to be talking about people who have menstrual cycles, but I'd like to be really clear that not all women experience menstrual cycles, and that doesn't make them any less women, and not everybody who menstruates identifies as a woman. So what is the menstrual cycle? Well, the menstrual cycle is on average 28 days long. This can vary from about 21 days to 35 days, but because all the medical textbooks use 28 days, that's what we're going to be using in this diagram. But do please keep in mind that the range is extreme. So we split the cycle into two phases. We've got the follicular phase over here, and then the luteal phase after that. Menstruation, or the period, begins the cycle. It can range between 2 to 7 days, and that is the period. So menstruation is the actual bleeding, whilst the menstrual cycle is the whole thing. Before the luteal phase, we've got ovulation, and that's what begins off the luteal phase. That's the releasing of an egg from the ovary. So every month, in response to reproductive hormones, mainly estrogen and progesterone, the womb is prepared for pregnancy. If the egg released during ovulation is not fertilized, then pregnancy doesn't occur and the lining of the uterus breaks down and sheds. Now, the cycle is characterized by changing hormones, a number of different hormones, but for this presentation, we're just going to focus on two. So we've got estrogen that has a large peak during the follicular phase and a smaller peak during the luteal phase, and then we also have progesterone. Now, all of this looks very scientific and very clinical, but the opinions and views on menstruation have not always been so clinical. In fact, through a lot of human history, views on menstruation have been overwhelmingly negative. So what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side is the Cachun Gynecological Papyrus. And this was written in, well, it's the oldest medical text we have, and it was written during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep II in about 1800 BCE. And that attributes illnesses ranging from eye soreness and muscle ache to the womb. Next, over here, we have the Huangdi Neijing, which is one of the oldest Chinese medical texts from the Han Dynasty era. This discusses menstruation and suggests that menstruation invites imbalance. This was about 111 BCE. Biblical references were also pretty negative, viewing menstruation as dirty and polluting. And then we've got Pliny the Elder over here, and he described the dangers of menstrual blood in his Natural History. He suggested that contact with menstrual blood could turn new wine sour and crops touched by it become barren, grass die, seeds in gardens are dried up, so on and so forth. Essentially, menstruation is dangerous. A little bit later on, Dr. John Burns, in his Principles of Midwifery in 1811, wrote that menstruation is to be considered as a disease. And then finally, Dr. Bella Schick described amenotoxin, in 1921. She suggested that there was a toxin in menstrual blood that could essentially kill plants and even prevent beer from fermenting. And what you see here is an experiment that she ran with 2 flowers, one in normal blood and distilled water, and one in menstrual blood and distilled water. And she suggested that the flower on the left had died because of the amenotoxin found in menstrual blood. Unfortunately for Dr. Schick, this study could never be replicated, and there is no evidence found that there was any sort of amenotoxin in menstrual blood. However, clearly the negative discourse around menstruation was embedded in public dialogue, and the act of experiencing life as a woman often viewed as symptomatic. One part of womanhood that was exposed to great scrutiny was PMS, or premenstrual syndrome. Since Hippocrates logged symptoms, these could have been some of the first descriptions of PMS in about 460 BC. Hippocrates suggested that these disorders or symptoms were a response to lunar phases, and these led to the belief of the wandering womb, essentially the idea that the uterus would float around the body due to the pull of the moon and block passages to the heart, which would result in madness. Progression into work on autopsies during the Renaissance challenged prior held beliefs about the wandering womb. As people began to do autopsies on women's bodies, it became very clear that the womb would not leave where its position was and wander around the body. And so the wandering womb was replaced by the word hysterical. Dr. Frederick Hollick wrote a book in 1855 called The Diseases of Women, Their Causes and Cure. And he describes that the kind of woman prone to hysteria would be like children. The merest trifles may make them transcendently happy or cast them into the most gloomy despair. So that was one of Hollick's famous statements from his book. Now, clearly hysteria was a very serious ailment that could make women depressed and unreasonable, according to Hollick. Another term that then entered the public canon was premenstrual tension. This arrived in 1931, coined by Frank, and he described a plethora of symptoms such as nervousness, impulsivity, and depression that women would experience the week before menstruation. In the early 1950s, Green and Dalton attempted to improve Frank's term and coined the phrase premenstrual syndrome. And they published this book right here, once a month, The Premenstrual Syndrome, which broadened both the time of the diagnosis, so it became any time during the second half of the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, and the range of the symptoms women experience to include sadness, constipation, anger, and food cravings, among many others. In the 1970s, the conversation shifted again, and raging hormones becomes part of the conversation. Now, this view suggested that women experience such surges of hormones at certain times of the month that they were out of control and unfit to be a mother or a worker, or basically out of control as a human. In the late 1900s, both medical professionals and academics maintained perspectives that menstruation was dangerous, and this affected the public's views on menstruation, PMS, and women. In fact, Hubert Humphrey's physician, so Hubert Humphrey was the 38th Vice President of America, declared that women's raging hormonal influences made them unfit for office. But what was going on in the background? So these dates diagnosing women with different aspects of hysteria, PMS, PMT, raging hormones correspond with women gaining rights, and so arguably were used as a way to keep women suppressed. 1840s, the women's suffrage movement begins to take off. The first National Women's Rights Convention in 1850. Then gradually, some women in the UK get the vote, white women in the US get the vote, and finally, all American women can vote and all women in the UK can vote. So as you can see, while women's rights become to get onto the agenda, only a few years later, hysteria becomes a medical condition which could undermine passionate voices of women calling for equality, and predictably, as women's rights become more widespread, more and more explanations pop up to show why women might be hysterical. This can also be seen in the rise and fall in popularity of menstrual leave. So what's menstrual leave? Well, menstrual leave is not a new phenomenon. It's the idea that a woman might need to take off time during a month, either before or during her menstrual cycle. It was originally implemented in factories in communist Russia in the 1920s, and this allowed women time off during their period. It only lasted 5 years in Russia because the women workers asked for it to be stopped because it led to employers searching for cheaper, reliable men over women. Menstrual leave was also rolled out in Japan, in South Korea, in Indonesia, among other countries. But the timing of implementing menstrual leave is interesting. A lot of countries implemented menstrual leave at the end of World War II. During the war, women were employed in male-dominated jobs like factories. Once the war had ended and men returned to find their jobs were taken up by women, we had a problem on our hands. The men needed jobs and the rhetoric changed. From during war years to women being really useful and needed in factory jobs, suddenly women are deemed too fragile to work. They are encouraged to leave work when married and take time off to protect their fertility. However, we know today that working during a menstrual cycle does not affect fertility. This rhetoric of protecting the national fertility becomes a surefire way to return jobs to men. We still see menstrual leave today, and some people suggest that it helps normalize menstruation, which is never a bad thing if we get menstruation on the public discourse. However, there is also evidence that this can cause more harm than good. For example, in China, which has menstrual leave still today, many jobs are paid according to workload. Days off makes women uncompetitive. In the UK, a few companies have followed suit, though the menstrual leave is more like flexible working hours. So on the one hand, it does normalize menstruation, but on the other hand, it also normalizes pain. So we have a little grounding in the historical views of menstruation. They're not overwhelmingly positive. What about PMS? So PMS, or premenstrual syndrome, is the name that we give to a collection of more than 200 different symptoms that some women experience the week before their periods. These can range from headaches to cramps to irritability. More than 80% of women have been said to experience one or more symptoms of PMS. But there is a huge amount of variation and diversity in the types of symptoms and the intensity of these symptoms experienced by women. Treatments today for PMS include use of hormonal contraceptives, cognitive behavioral therapy, that's CBT, antidepressants, and anti-inflammatories. So, are women mad? Are women bad? Or are women just angry with justification? So anthropologists, that's what I do, so we study human behavior, have emphasized the importance of the social dimension in understanding the premenstrual experience, and they argue that the discourse around women's menstrual cycles has been patriarchal. In fact, some feminist researchers have argued that the concept of PMS may stem from patriarchal norms, an attempt to subjugate women into the position of a sufferer. But if you've spoken to somebody who's experiencing PMS, there is more than just social influences going on. People really do suffer, and we can't invalidate their experiences. And this is why it's so important to study PMS from a holistic approach that includes biological as well as a social understanding for what is going on. It doesn't mean that PMS is invented. It just means that the impact of stress, the environment, and the attitudes of people around menstruating people can affect PMS. That being said, some women do experience debilitating pain, and that cannot be overlooked. Now, there isn't a test that can be used to diagnose PMS, so descriptions are really important. The psychological symptoms for PMS include depression, anxiety, irritability, and most of these symptoms actually rely on individual descriptions. For somebody to be diagnosed with PMS, they typically have to fill in a questionnaire like this one here. And this kind of questionnaire will demonstrate the different symptoms that women experience, when in their cycle they experience them, and how severe the experience is. Now, for a woman to be diagnosed with PMS, These have to be the week before their period, and they have to be severe. They have to be so severe that they impact daily life of women. The thing is how we expect to experience the menstrual cycle can also in turn impact how that cycle is experienced. If somebody tells you over and over again that you're going to have these awful symptoms a few days before your period, you can end up with a nocebo effect. This is the opposite of a placebo. So in a placebo, you expect something good to happen and then something good happens. In a nocebo effect, you expect something bad to happen and the body mounts a physiological response to anticipate something bad happening. And then as a result, something bad actually can happen within the body. So if you've got a lot of stress because you're expecting something negative to happen, that manifests physiologically. And so actually it can make you sick as well. So some changes are to be expected. Changes in blood sugar levels throughout the cycle, which are impacted by hormones. These can lead to cravings for different foods and irritability. Sounds a lot like PMS to me. Changes in hormone levels can also have an impact on skin. So some people might have dry or oily skin the week before their period. So we need to differentiate what is normal and expected the week before the period and what is actual debilitating PMS. Sometimes the differences in menstrual cycle experiences can be impacted by the environment, and thoughts about PMS in fact have actually been described as a culture-bound syndrome. So people living in different countries and from different cultures can sometimes describe very different experiences of PMS. For example, in the UK, we hear about cramps a lot, and in Japan, women describe pressure on their backs and shoulders. So there are a few myths that are found in a number of cultures, including our own, and one of those is that of syncing periods and the moon. So a common belief is that the menstrual cycle synchronizes with the moon. This is a fair enough belief to have because the menstrual cycle is on average about 28 days long, and the average lunar cycle is about 29 days long. So in the past, when people didn't have access to calendars and phones to track days, the lunar cycle was often used to track time. And there are a lot of people who thought that the cycle of the moon had a direct impact on the menstrual cycle. But if that was the case, then we wouldn't see the range of lengths of menstrual cycles that we see today. From 21 days to about 35 days, all of that range is a normal menstrual cycle. And actually, the length of that menstrual cycle can vary both women to women, but also within the lifetime of one woman. So she might start off with very long cycles and end up with shorter cycles later on in life. We'd also see if the moon syncing was to be believed, we would see lots of women syncing at the same time. So all ovulating at the same time and all having their periods at the same time. We don't see that. Now, some people have actually argued that that might be due to the fact that we live in a modern era with electricity and light. That could be used as an explanation why the body can't sync up with the moon because we just don't see it enough. But that's really unlikely because there are plenty of people still today who live without electricity, and they also do not display this kind of synchronization. Also, they don't display synchronizing with each other. This is another common myth that I used to have, which is that people who live very close together menstruate at the same time. My supervisor did a study into this and found that there really was no evidence for this at all. Now, you'd be forgiven for having this idea because I also used to have it, but actually humans just look for patterns. And if one girl is menstruating and is coming to the end of her period and another one begins her period and they overlap just for one day of bleeding, people will see a pattern in that and suggest that they've synced up. But actually, statistically, if one person's cycle is 24 days long and another person's cycle is 30 days long, at some stage they will overlap. And then that doesn't necessarily mean they've synchronized, it just means that they've overlapped. Just because women's cycles don't synchronize with the moon and don't synchronize with each other doesn't mean that they can't be supportive of each other. There's a lot of rituals that people use with the moon and with each other, all surrounding menstruation, which can carry on despite the fact that women do not sync up with the moon nor with each other. So, tracking the cycle. One of the ways that we have learned that syncing with the moon and syncing with each other doesn't happen is because we've started tracking cycles. Now, the problem with pain is it is subjective. You can't measure it like you might measure somebody's temperature. So a really good resource for women and doctors and researchers to understand changes through the menstrual cycle is to use a tracker. By tracking a cycle, patterns can become clear. Something normal from one woman may be abnormal in another woman and merit further investigation. There are a lot of ways to track cycles. One can do it by hand, and a really good resource is on Menstrual Matters, which is a website that I think Bell House will send out in the email later. If you'd prefer to do it by hand, or if people prefer to use apps, there's a lot of them available, some free and some not. If you wanted my advice, you should look for an app that allows you to export your data so that you can use it, and also that keeps your data safe. I use Clue, but I also work with Clue, so full transparency, you know, I'm not paid to promote, but I like Clue a lot. So while some women experience small or no changes throughout the menstrual cycle, others can experience real life affecting pain. And this is unacceptable. People shouldn't have to live with chronic pain. And in fact, this is one of the problems with menstrual leave, is that it's normalized that women should be expecting so much pain every month that they should be they need to take a few days off because of it. Nobody should be living with this kind of chronic pain. So some pain before and during the period is to be expected. Cramping in particular, because the womb is essentially made up of a thick wall of muscle, and muscle spasms allow the body to move the lining of the womb out of the body, in a similar way to cramps experienced during childbirth, though to a lesser degree. If your symptoms either before or during menstruation are so debilitating that you cannot work, it isn't normal and should not be normalized. The problem is that pain has often been normalized for women, particularly for Black women, who are much more likely to be turned away by doctor surgeries and labeled as hypochondriacs even today. There is an incorrect view that Black and white people are biologically different, and that Black women feel less pain than white women do. This is shown in the consistent underprescription of painkillers by doctors to Black people in the UK. These beliefs in biological differences between race were championed by scientists and doctors to justify slavery and the inhumane use of Black men and women in medical research. Even into the 20th century, researchers continued to experiment on Black people based in part on the assumption that the Black body was more resistant to pain and injury. Despite decades of research, why some women experience PMS and others do not remains unclear. Some have argued that PMS may stem from hormonal level differences. We saw before that cycle of hormones. It would be reasonable to assume that the cycle of hormones could cause PMS, but there is no evidence to support this. Studies looking into different women's hormonal levels and hormonal changes do not lead to any clarification on why one woman might experience PMS and the other not. The truth is, we aren't really sure why some women experience PMS and others don't, but we have some ideas. Why don't we know more about PMS? Well, the sad truth is that women have been historically omitted from research. It was only relatively recently that women were able to become doctors and researchers, and so-called women's issues were often forgotten or neglected. For a long time, the prevailing belief was that women were just small men, and so research into men's bodies were thought to be applicable to women as well. Now, there are protectionist guidelines for medical research, and there was a huge reluctance to test drugs on reproductive age women. And this was prompted in part by the thalidomide experiment, which led to the death of 80,000 babies. So a lot of medical research practices that we get today are based on what is normal for men, because the studies have been performed on men. Why are the studies performed on men? Partly because they are thought to be easier to study because they don't have these cycles of hormones. Now, because we've seen before that reproductive age women have variation in hormone levels, which means that they are more variable, if you were to include them in experiments, you would need to include them at all different phases of the menstrual cycle to understand how one medication or one experiment might impact a woman at a different part of her cycle. So instead of using women and using them at all sorts of different stages of their reproductive cycles, instead men and postmenopausal women are used because they're thought to be more stable. Still today, women remain underrepresented in medical research. It's not just humans, but animals as well. Over 80% of studies use only male animals. Now, through a lack of research and historically through a majority of male physicians, the female life cycle is still seen as more complex than the default male one. And this leads to something that feminist research has called male as norm. It's really important to clarify that the female life cycle is not more complex than the male life cycle. It's just different. The reproductive cycle and the reproductive phases are just different, not more complicated. They're only seen as more complicated because no one's actually done the studies. Now, if you take this idea of male as norm, in our society, we view disease as something defined as a deviation from the normal. So you're diseased or you're sick if something isn't normal. So it's maybe unsurprising that the unpredictable nature of the menstrual cycle has been described as evolutionarily abnormal and perhaps even dangerous. This idea that women are deviant from the normal can lead to the idea that even the most normal women are sick. Now, the issues that affect everybody don't include women. The studies into the issues that affect everybody often don't include women. Not only that, but issues that only affect women are often understudied. So women are hit with this double layer of omission from research. So why do we actually think women get PMS? As I've explained already, we're not sure. There hasn't been enough research, but we have some ideas, and this is what we're studying at the moment. So one idea is that of inflammation. We know that these hormones, progesterone, estrogen here, and progesterone change throughout the cycle. These hormones are related to inflammation. So inflammation goes up and down with them. What does inflammation do? Well, inflammation is the body's way to protect itself from infection. Too much inflammation can lead to depression, anxiety, increased blood pressure, and other things. Inflammation protects the body, but too much inflammation does not. If we go back to this diagram of the menstrual cycle, we can actually think of it as a cycle of inflammation. During ovulation right here, part of the immune system is suppressed. That is because the egg needs to be able to embed itself and implant if it's fertilized. For something to implant into a body, well, the immune system needs to be suppressed just slightly, otherwise the body will react to it, mount a huge inflammatory response and reject the egg completely. So for a little bit, the immunity is downregulated. After the egg is fertilized and embeds, or if it is not fertilized and leaves as menstruation, then the immune system goes right back up to where it was before, and inflammation shoots up. And some people have suggested that it is this inflammation that can lead to premenstrual syndrome. So my PhD supervisor, Alex Alban over here, has been working on this for a long time, and she suggests that PMS could actually be a byproduct of these changes in inflammation that we experience every month. So it would make sense that some of the symptoms of PMS are alleviated with anti-inflammatory medicines. That's what we're trying to research right now. So some past research that we've done last year has involved looking at the way that we ask people about their premenstrual experiences. If you're a doctor, or if you're a woman who's been to the doctors about PMS, or even you've spoken to a woman who's been to the doctors about PMS, you might have tried to think about how you were asked about PMS. The likelihood is you were asked to fill out some kind of survey like the one we showed before. It turns out, based on our research here, that the way you ask women about their premenstrual experience affects what they will report. If you ask somebody what premenstrual syndrome symptoms they experience, they'll tell you overwhelmingly negative responses, things like cramps or depression or headaches. Now, if you ask women with some very clear language and ask for both negative and positive changes, our research has suggested that despite the fact that the reports are overwhelmingly negative, so to be very clear, PMS is still very debilitating for a lot of women, some women do actually report positive changes. These can include increased libido, increased energy. So we think that both the way that we ask about PMS can affect how women respond, but also inflammation is key. So if you ask women in specific ways, then you can expect to get specific type of responses. So it's very important that we in medical professions actually ask women very clearly what they experience, and don't already preempt what they experience by asking what symptoms they have. If we reframe the conversation as changes rather than symptoms, we might be able to clarify a little bit more the different experiences that women have. Now, because COVID is an inflammatory illness, we're at the moment trying to study whether there is any impact that COVID could have on the menstrual cycle. And if you'd like to be involved, I'll add the link to the study in the email that Bell House will send out after. Our idea is that as the menstrual cycle is a cycle of inflammation and COVID is inflammatory, then perhaps there could be some kind of link or effect that one may have on the other. But to be very clear, this is not yet, we haven't proven anything so far. We're just doing surveys. And once we finish the surveys, we hope to get some kind of clinical research going as well. Now, at the moment, vaccines are a huge part of the conversation. And I don't study vaccines at all, but there is a fantastic researcher in America, Kate Clancy, who has a lab, and they are studying vaccines. So I'll add that to the email to be sent out as well, if you'd like to take part in that. So that's pretty much all I've got for you guys today. So thank you very much for listening. And I want to say a big thank you to Clue for working with me, my university and the ESRC for funding me, and my supervisor, Alex Alvern, for the support. So if anybody has any questions, I think we've got plenty of time. So I'm going to stop sharing, and please do ask.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriella. That's such an insightful talk, and it's so positive to hear that more research is occurring, and hopefully your understanding of the condition will really increase. So yeah, we do have time for questions, which is great. Questions and comments. The chat box is open, so if you'd like your question to be read out, please do pop it in there. And if you want to ask a question anonymously, please feel free to message myself or my co-host Kirsty privately, and then we can read it out anonymously. And if you'd like to ask a question yourself, please go on the reactions tab, and you should be able to raise your hand, and then we can come to you and you can ask a question yourself. I think we do have one question in there straight away, which is great, which is, how has the increased use of hormonal contraceptives changed how we think about PMS and the menstrual cycle?
That's a really good question. So using hormonal there's lots of different types of hormonal contraceptives. There's progesterone only, and then there's combined hormonal contraceptives as well. And these can change, well, they basically stop you from having periods. And so if you're not having periods and you're not ovulating, then you're not going to be experiencing this cycle of inflammation. That's not to say that people who are using hormonal contraceptives don't experience side effects of using them. They do. And actually my colleague in our lab, Rose Stevens, is studying this. So I'll link her in the email as well. But essentially it's made us even more sure that part of what's going on, and I must emphasize only part, because PMS is a real issue that affects people, and the pain that women experience is real. But because a lot of people on hormonal contraceptives have bleeds, and they may be regular bleeds, depending on the type of contraceptive they have reported that the week before their periods, which are not actual periods, they're just bleeds, they experience symptoms like PMS, and whether that's withdrawal of hormones or it's a little bit in the mind, it doesn't really matter. If women are experiencing pain, then that deserves research as well. But it's the use of hormonal contraceptives has just added to what we need to study to try and understand a little bit more about what's going on.
Thank you. So another question coming through is, would you say that conventional period products, both in their marketing and the actual components of them with traces of toxic chemicals, have an impact on physical and physiological and psychological, PMS experiences?
Interesting. Okay, so sorry, the question's moving. Let me just pin that. Okay, so conventional period products, I assume it means tampons and pads and things like that. And there's a lot of information, sometimes that does the rounds, that suggests that the chemicals used maybe to bleach the materials are toxic and can affect women. It's a tricky one. Does it have an impact on physical symptoms of PMS? Very unlikely. These have all been regulated and passed by various organizations, which means they are safe to use. So it's not that there's toxicity in them that could affect PMS. What could affect PMS, particularly the psychological experiences of PMS, is the hiding of menstrual blood. So before people had access to tampons and pads and things like that, lots of things like menstrual rags were used, which had to be washed, hung up, dried. And it was very obvious when a woman was menstruating, and it was obvious to her, and it was obvious to her surrounding friends and family. Today, a lot of women are able to conceal when they're menstruating. And so it's not clear to anybody else when they're menstruating. And so perhaps there could be some grounds for suggesting that if nobody knows when they're menstruating, then either people don't tease or irritate a woman. So lots of girls at school are asked if they're on their periods because they're being argumentative. But there's also reason to believe that it lessens the amount of support that women can get. So there was a really interesting study done by Jane Ussher, which looked at how partner support, both in heterosexual relationships, so one man, one woman, and also homosexual relationships, two women, could affect and alleviate symptoms of PMS. And that study found that partners who were supportive, so supportive men and also just women partners full stop, really helped to support and alleviate symptoms of PMS. And so arguably, if somebody is not clearly and evidently menstruating, by using products like tampons, which conceal the fact that they're menstruating, perhaps unless they ask for support, then they won't automatically get it because nobody else would know that they're menstruating. But do the products themselves have an impact? No. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, so next we've got, do you have any idea how might you explain increased negative symptoms in the perimenopause?
Another really good question. So perimenopause is is the time between normal cyclical periods that a woman experiences for a lot of her lifetime, and then also menopause. So as she's becoming menopausal and the menstrual cycles stop. How could I explain negative symptoms in the perimenopause? Well, the perimenopause is also characterized by shifting hormones, which itself can influence different levels of inflammation. So there might also be an inflammatory response to that. I don't study menopause. There's another girl who does, Abby, who I can also link in the email if you like, and you can have a look at some of that research as well.
Great, thank you. So thank you for a superb talk. Do you think there is a place in society for menstrual leave and or protections for women with PMS? Or do you think they are too risky in terms of being abused to keep women out of positions of power / jobs?
I think, bearing in mind that from a personal perspective, my job allows me to be where I want, when I want. I'm a PhD researcher. I don't need to ask for permission to take toilet breaks, and I don't need to handle anything toxic or chemicals on my hands that might then become an issue if I went to change a sanitary pad or a tampon or something like that. So I'm coming from a very privileged background. Do I think that there's a place in society for menstrual leave? Not really. And that is because I do think that it's very risky, because I would say that it allows people to position women and be protective over women's fertility rather than giving them the option to do so. I also think that historically, cases where people have been allowed to take menstrual leave hasn't worked, because often it's unpaid, and so women don't want to take it, and often it is not used because it's unpaid and because it means that the employers might go and ask somebody else instead. So I think it's very risky. It can keep women out of the job market. And as I said earlier in the presentation, I think it's also dangerous because it normalizes women needing to stay at home a few days a month because their symptoms are so bad. Nobody should be living with such debilitating symptoms. However, even though I don't believe menstrual leave is necessary, flexible working hours are important, as well as having access to toilets and sanitary products on site. I think the bigger issue is forcing women to work for hours at a time without toilet breaks, or being docked toilet breaks from their pay, or not having washing facilities in their place of work. I think that's a far more dangerous thing, and that is what we really need to focus on. But it's quite nice if women have the option as well.
Thank you, that's really interesting. How do you differentiate the emotional ability experienced, how do you differentiate the emotional ability experienced in pregnant women as dissimilar to what they could experience in PMS? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's just asking, I think if I understand the question, it's asking whether the differences that pregnant women experience during pregnancy are different from PMS. And actually, so in my PhD, one of my studies is looking at inflammation in pregnant women. And that's because I don't have access to data on normally cycling women. So I've got a study group who were pregnant at different times and at different stages. Inflammatory levels were taken from them, measurements to see what kind of inflammatory state they were in. And actually there's a lot of research suggesting that the different trimesters of pregnancy are actually like a very augmented version of the menstrual cycle. So you get at the beginning, you get this kind of down regulation of the immune response to allow for the implantation of an embryo, and so it's not rejected. And then at the very end of pregnancy, again, you need this down regulation of immunity so that you can, so that one can give birth. And then in the middle, you get an upregulation of immunity. And what that leads to is women being susceptible to different types of infections at different stages during pregnancy, depending on what kind of inflammatory response the body is mounting. So I really think, obviously I'm an advocate for studying women's health generally, but I really think that understanding pregnancy will really help to understand patterns that women experience during PMS as well.
So as a PMDD sufferer, severe PMS, I've had to take sick leave and reasonable workplace adjustments. It's worth pointing out that it is covered by the 2010 Equality Act as a disability and chronic illness.
Yeah, absolutely. So PMDD is an incredibly severe form of PMS, and this is debilitating and really prevents people from going about their day-to-day lives normally. And as Cyan says, it is in the 2010 Equality Act as a chronic illness. And so menstrual leave of normal menstrual cycles should not impact the effects that PMDD sufferers have reasonable workplace adjustments, flexible leave, different working styles, and workplace adjustments are crucial.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I didn't know that had been put into the law. And just a follow up as well from the last question was, that's interesting, thank you. And actually we've seen that women with rheumatoid arthritis and ME/CFS, that their symptoms also diminish during pregnancy, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And we should talk, Hannah, after, because different stages of the menstrual cycle also see slight alleviation or worsening of different types of illnesses, and things like rheumatoid arthritis and even eczema fluctuate during the menstrual cycle. So it's really interesting.
So then following on, so do you think with greater understanding on what PMS is caused by, there can be a cultural shift in the stereotypical image of women being emotional or irritable, thinking of some of the toxic workplace, schoolplace stereotypes that actually inhibit women's rights to speak out? Or is this a much bigger picture now separate from the historical legacy of where the beliefs come from, as you explained early on in the presentation?
Ooh, that is a great question. So I don't think that we can divide how current views are shaped. We can't divide the current views on menstruation and PMS from the historical legacy that is years, well, decades and decades of negative views of menstruation and PMS, but also more importantly of women. So historically, women, as I mentioned earlier, have been subjugated and put into passive positions and told to be quiet and fertile. And so, you know, a lot has happened in a relatively short amount of time. Women got the vote, women are in workplace, arguably, you know, have all the same opportunities that men have. And so what we're left with is the kind of remnants of a very toxic history of views on women, which leads to these stereotypical views that women are emotional instead of just angry, or bossy instead of just in control. And when I hear people say things like that, you know, I can't help but think that they're just other ways to put women down. There's a real problem in society, and it's not just men, it's also internalized sexism and misogyny, that, you know, a woman shouldn't speak out and shouldn't be active and loud, and a respectful woman should be quiet. So I think that if we can all understand a little bit about the history of PMS and the history of menstruation, then it might help us to understand why these jokes and memes come about women being irrational during their periods, and hopefully help prevent these kind of toxic environments that I think a lot of us will have experienced growing up and also in the workplace today.
Yeah, totally. If anyone else has any questions, please do put them in the chat or raise your hand. I just had a private one saying, is there any chance that, because we don't have a full understanding of PMS yet, that actually it being such a, is it definitely one distinct disorder, or is there a chance, because it's such a wide varied thing, could it be kind of separate things?
Yeah, I wish I had a really clear answer for you. I don't, because it's not been elucidated yet. The research suggests that it is a combination of different things. So you get PMS, which might be caused by shifting hormones that lead to inflammation, but also inflammation generally has a lot of symptoms that are very similar to PMS, headaches and changes in appetite, lethargy and things like that. So I think definitely it is a bundle of things that are kind of packaged up and sold as PMS. Yeah.
Thank you. So unless anyone has any other questions, yeah, do put those in the chat, but otherwise, I think thank you very much. This has been such an interesting talk, such an interesting presentation. I've really learnt loads. So just to wrap up, I think, thank you all for coming. I really hope you found the talk interesting and informative. As I mentioned before, we are going to send round an email with some further resources, and on that email there's also a link to a feedback form. So we would love to hear your opinions and any other ideas you have that you'd like talks to be done. We would love to hear those as well. So yeah, thank you all so much, and
thank you.
Thank you for coming through in the chat as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.